The iron cage rattled against the wooden planks of the steamboat as it made its way up the Mississippi River in the autumn of 1879. Inside, a massive silverback gorilla threw himself against the bars with such force that the entire vessel seemed to shudder. His roars echoed across the water, sending flocks of egret scattering from the cypress trees lining the banks. Passengers kept their distance, some crossing themselves, others whispering that the beast was possessed by demons. But Cornelius Whitmore stood at the bow with his arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing across his tobacco-stained lips. He had paid a fortune for this creature, more than he had ever spent on any single piece of property, human or otherwise, and he intended to make sure every plantation owner from Natchez to Vicksburg knew about it. Whitmore was not a man given to modest displays. His plantation, Sweetwater Grove, sprawled across 3,000 acres of rich delta soil, worked by over 200 enslaved men, women, and children. He wore custom-tailored suits from New Orleans, drank French wine with his supper, and kept a stable of thoroughbred horses that were the envy of the county. But none of that was enough anymore. Every planter with money could buy silk and horseflesh. Whitmore wanted something that would set him apart, something that would cement his reputation as a man of vision and power. When he had heard about the exotic animal dealer in Charleston, who specialized in African specimens, an idea had taken root in his mind. He would bring the savagery of the Dark Continent itself to his plantation. He would show his neighbors, his competitors, and most importantly, his enslaved workers exactly what kind of force could be tamed and controlled by a man of true authority. Before we continue with this shocking story about the gorilla, don't forget to comment which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you. And now, back to the story. The gorilla had been captured in the dense forests of what European maps still called the Congo Free State, though there was nothing free about it for the people or animals who lived there. A Belgian trading company had commissioned hunters to bring back exotic specimens for European zoos and wealthy collectors. The silverback had been tracked for weeks. His troop gradually herded toward a clearing where nets and rifles waited. When the trap was sprung, 3 younger gorillas had been killed trying to defend him. The silverback himself had fought like a demon, breaking the arm of one hunter and nearly killing another before a rifle butt to the skull had finally brought him down. They had dragged his unconscious body into a cage barely large enough to contain him. And from that moment until he reached the Charleston docks 6 weeks later, he had known nothing but violence, hunger, and the constant roll of the ship that carried him away from everything he had ever known. By the time Whitmore took possession of the animal, the gorilla was a concentrated mass of rage. The dealers warned him that the beast was untamable, that even the most experienced animal handlers had refused to enter his cage. One man had tried and lost 3 fingers for his trouble. But Whitmore was not discouraged. In fact, the creature's ferocity only increased its value in his eyes. He wanted his enslaved workers to see something truly terrifying, something that would remind them that even the most powerful force of nature could be brought to heel by the right application of human will and ingenuity. And if the gorilla could not be tamed, well, there was always the option of having him shot and stuffed. Either way, Whitmore would get his spectacle. The steamboat docked at the Sweetwater Grove landing just after dawn on a Thursday morning in late October. The air was thick with morning mist rising off the river, and the cypress trees stood like ghosts in the gray light. Whitmore had ordered his overseer, a brutal man named Tuck Brennan, to assemble every enslaved person on the plantation in the main yard. Men who normally would have been in the fields at first light stood in silent rows. Women who worked in the house or the laundry held their children close. Everyone knew something unusual was happening, but nobody knew what. Rumors had been circulating for days. Some said the master had bought a new overseer, one even meaner than Brennan. Others whispered that he was bringing in slave catchers with tracking dogs, preparing for trouble that had not yet arrived. A few of the older people who remembered being brought across the ocean themselves feared that new captives were being delivered, and with them the fresh trauma of separation and sale. What arrived instead defied everyone's expectations. A massive wagon rolled into the yard, pulled by 6 draft horses straining against their harnesses. On the wagon bed sat the iron cage covered with heavy canvas. The sounds coming from beneath that canvas made children press their faces into their mothers' skirts. Deep guttural roars mixed with the metallic screech of claws or hands scraping against iron bars. The canvas bulged and shifted as whatever was inside threw itself against its prison. Whitmore walked alongside the wagon, his chest puffed out like a rooster, clearly enjoying the fear and confusion on the faces around him. Brennan walked on the other side, a rifle cradled in his arms, his usual sneer somehow even more pronounced. When the wagon came to a stop in the center of the yard, Whitmore climbed onto a wooden platform that had been erected for the occasion. He surveyed his audience with the practiced eye of a man who viewed human beings as livestock. Then he began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent crowd with the authority of someone who had never been contradicted in his life. He told them about the Dark Continent, about the savage lands where their ancestors had come from, lands of darkness and chaos that lacked the civilizing influence of Christian white men. He told them about the dangerous beasts that roam those forests, creatures of pure instinct and violence. And then, with a theatrical flourish, he ordered Brennan to pull back the canvas. The gorilla that was revealed stood nearly 6 feet tall, even in the cramped confines of his cage. His shoulders were impossibly broad, packed with muscle that bunched and shifted under his dark fur. His face was a mask of barely contained fury, with deep-set eyes that seemed to burn with intelligence and hate. The moment the canvas was removed and sunlight hit him, he exploded into motion, slamming his massive fists against the bars with such force that the entire wagon shook. His roar was unlike anything most of the people assembled had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from some primal place before language, before civilization, before chains. Most of the enslaved workers took an instinctive step backward. Children cried out. Even some of the white overseers who had gathered to watch the show looked uncomfortable. But in the middle of the crowd, one man stood perfectly still. His name was a baby, though he had been forced to answer to the name Il for so long that sometimes he almost forgot his real one. He was in his early 30s, tall and lean with the kind of wiry strength that came from a lifetime of brutal labor. His face was normally impassive, carefully schooled to show none of the thoughts or feelings that moved behind his eyes. Enslaved people learned early that displays of emotion could be dangerous, that it was safest to become a mask, to let masters and overseers see only what they expected to see. But now, as a baby stared at the gorilla in the cage, something in that mask cracked. His eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat because he had seen something that nobody else in that yard could possibly have noticed. When the gorilla raised his left hand to slam it against the bars, Abby glimpsed the palm, and there, stark against the dark skin, was a distinctive marking, a patch of lighter pigmentation in the unmistakable shape of a crescent moon. It was roughly the size of a silver dollar positioned right in the center of the palm, where a fortune teller might claim to read the lines of fate. A baby knew that mark. He had seen it before years ago in another life that felt like a dream or a story that had happened to someone else. He had been a child then, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, living in a village deep in the forests of what white men would later tell him was the Gold Coast. His father had been a skilled hunter and tracker, respected in their community for his knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants. Abe had often accompanied his father on expeditions, learning to read signs in the undergrowth, to move silently through the trees, to understand the language of birds and the warnings carried on the wind. On one of these journeys, they had encountered a troop of gorillas. His father had taught him to keep his distance, to show respect for these powerful creatures who were cousins to humans in ways that Europeans would not understand or acknowledge for many years to come. But there had been one young gorilla, barely more than an infant, who had been separated from his troop. Perhaps he had wandered too far while playing, or perhaps some predator had scattered the group. The young gorilla had been frightened and alone, making distressed calls that his father had recognized immediately. Rather than simply leaving the creature to find his own way back, Abby's father had decided they would help him. For 3 days they had tracked the gorilla troop, the young one following them through the forest. Abe had been fascinated by the infant, by his expressive face and his obvious intelligence. During rest periods, the young gorilla would approach cautiously, and a baby would share bits of fruit with him. It was during one of these moments that a baby had first noticed the distinctive mark on the gorilla's left palm. He had pointed it out to his father, who had nodded thoughtfully and said that this was a sign, that the mark meant this gorilla had a special destiny, that their paths had crossed for a reason. When they finally located the troop and the young gorilla was reunited with what was presumably his mother, Abe had felt both happy and sad. He had grown attached to the creature in their short time together. As they walked away, leaving the gorillas to their forest life, Abe had looked back one last time. The young gorilla had been watching him too, and Abe could have sworn he saw recognition in those dark eyes, an acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. That had been more than 2 decades ago. Not long after that journey, Abe's village had been attacked by slavers, African collaborators working for European traders who prowled the coast. He remembered fire and screaming, remembered his mother pushing him and his sister toward the forest, telling them to run. He remembered turning back to see his father fighting 3 men. Remembered the sound of the club that struck his father down. He and his sister had run, but not far enough. They had been caught, bound, and marched to the coast along with dozens of others from their village and neighboring communities. The middle passage that followed had been a nightmare that a baby's mind had tried to protect him from by blurring the details. He remembered darkness, the stench of human waste and death, the constant sound of crying and praying. He remembered his sister's hand in his, and then he remembered her hand going limp, and then he remembered her being taken away. He had learned later, though nobody told him directly, that she had died in the hold of that ship, one of countless thousands who would never see land again. When Abe had finally been dragged up onto the deck and into the sunlight of a Charleston auction block, he had been 11 years old, alone, and so traumatized that he had not spoken for months. The man who bought him that day had been Cornelius Whitmore's father. Abe had spent his entire adult life on this plantation, had survived fevers and beatings, and the casual cruelty that was woven into every aspect of enslaved life. He had learned English, had learned to hide his thoughts, had learned to survive. He had even formed cautious friendships with others in the quarters, people who shared his condition, if not his specific history. But he had never forgotten who he had been before, never forgotten his real name, never forgotten the forest and the village and the young gorilla with the crescent moon mark on his palm. And now, impossibly, that same gorilla stood before him in an iron cage in the Mississippi Delta. Abe knew it was impossible. He knew that even if the gorilla had survived to adulthood, even if he had been captured rather than killed, the chances of him ending up on this specific plantation were so astronomical as to be meaningless. And yet, a baby also knew what he had seen. That mark was too distinctive to be coincidence. This was the same gorilla, fully grown now, transformed into the massive silverback that raged against his bars. The young frightened infant who had followed them through the forest had become this magnificent and terrifying creature, and like Abe himself, he had been ripped from his home, transported across an ocean, and imprisoned in a strange land. The gorilla's roaring gradually subsided into a series of deep rumbling vocalizations. And then, perhaps drawn by a baby's unwavering stare, the gorilla turned his head. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. For a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The crowd of enslaved workers, the leering overseers, even Whitmore on his platform, all became background noise. A baby and the gorilla simply looked at each other, and something passed between them, a recognition that went beyond rational explanation. The gorilla's posture changed. The aggressive tension in his massive shoulders relaxed slightly. He stopped rattling the bars. Instead, he moved to the front of the cage, lowered himself into a sitting position, and continued to stare at a baby. His expression, insofar as a gorilla's face could be read by human observers, shifted from pure rage to something more complex, confusion perhaps, or memory. His left hand came up slowly, almost as if he was examining his own palm, looking at the crescent mark that had identified him since birth. Around them, people began to notice the strange interaction. Whispers spread through the crowd. Even Brennan, who was not a particularly observant man, sensed that something unusual was happening. He barked at Abe to get back in line, to stop staring at the beast like a fool. But Abe barely heard him. For the first time in more than 20 years, he felt a connection to his old life, to the person he had been before the chains. This gorilla was a living link to his childhood, to his father, to the forest where he had once been free. Whitmore, still on his platform, was annoyed that his show had been disrupted. He had intended to give a longer speech about the animal, about his own greatness in acquiring such a specimen, but the strange behavior of the gorilla had stolen his thunder. He ordered Brennan to move the cage to the barn where it would be housed, and he commanded the enslaved workers to get to their assigned tasks. As the crowd began to disperse, Abe kept his eyes on the cage until it disappeared through the barn doors. The gorilla, for his part, never looked away from Abe either. That night, Abe lay on the rough wooden platform that served as his bed in the men's quarters. Around him, others were already sleeping, exhausted from another day of backbreaking labor. But Abe's mind was racing. He knew that somehow, impossibly fate or providence or pure chance had brought him face to face with a creature from his past. He also knew that the gorilla's fate on this plantation would not be a kind one. Whitmore was already talking about training the beast to fight, about pitting him against dogs or even enslaved men for the entertainment of visitors. If the gorilla could not be tamed for such purposes, he would be killed, his body mounted and displayed as a trophy. Abe had learned long ago that he was powerless to change his own circumstances. He had seen friends sold away, had seen families torn apart, had watched as any resistance or defiance was crushed with immediate and brutal force. The system of enslavement was designed to break spirits as thoroughly as it broke bodies. But something about seeing that gorilla, about recognizing in him a fellow survivor of the same catastrophe that had destroyed Abi's life, kindled something in his chest that he had thought was long dead. It was not quite hope, not yet. But it was something adjacent to hope, something that felt dangerous and necessary at the same time. Over the following days, a baby found excuses to work near the barn where the gorilla was kept. The massive silverback had been moved to a specially reinforced stall, still caged, but now with slightly more room to move. Whitmore had brought in a supposed animal trainer from New Orleans, a con man who claimed to have worked with exotic beasts in traveling shows. The man lasted 2 days before admitting that the gorilla was beyond his abilities. The creature would not eat, would barely drink, and launched himself at anyone who approached with such ferocity that even the bravest men kept their distance. But Abi noticed something that the white men did not. Whenever he walked past the barn, whenever he was close enough for the gorilla to see or scent him, the animal would calm slightly. The constant roaring would subside into softer vocalizations. The aggressive displays would pause. It was not taming exactly, but it was a response, a recognition of some kind. A baby began to deliberately linger near the barn, ostensibly checking on equipment or moving supplies, but really just maintaining that strange connection. One evening, after most of the overseers had retired for the night and only a single guard remained posted at a distance, a baby slipped into the barn. His heart hammered in his chest. If he was caught here, especially alone with the gorilla, the punishment would be severe. But he needed to know if what he suspected was true, if the recognition he had seen in the gorilla's eyes was real, or just his own desperate imagination. The barn was dim, lit only by moonlight filtering through gaps in the boards. The gorilla's stall was at the far end, and Abe could hear him moving restlessly in the darkness. As a baby approached, the sound stopped. He moved slowly, carefully until he was standing just outside the reinforced bars of the cage. The gorilla sat in the shadows, watching him with eyes that gleamed in the faint light. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly the gorilla extended his left arm through the bars, palm up, the crescent mark clearly visible even in the darkness. Abi felt tears prick his eyes. The first tears he had allowed himself to shed in years. He reached out and placed his own hand near the gorilla's palm, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the massive creature. The gorilla made a sound, not a roar, but something softer, almost questioning. A baby began to speak in his native language, words he had not used aloud since childhood, words that felt strange and familiar on his tongue. He did not know if the gorilla could understand human speech, if he could possibly remember the language of the forest where they had both been born. But Abi spoke anyway, telling the gorilla who he was, reminding him of the days they had spent together, acknowledging their shared loss. Whether the gorilla understood the words or simply responded to a baby's tone, something shifted in that moment. The massive creature's body language changed from aggressive weariness to something that almost resembled trust. He withdrew his arm slowly, then moved to the corner of his cage, where a bucket of water stood untouched. He drank, something he had barely done since his arrival. Then he reached for the food that had been left for him, stale bread and withered vegetables, and began to eat. It was a small thing, but in the context of his previous complete refusal, it was significant. A baby stayed in the barn for perhaps 20 minutes, speaking softly, maintaining the connection. When he finally left, he felt something stirring in him that he barely recognized after so many years of forced numbness. It was the beginning of an idea, wild and dangerous and probably suicidal. But once it took root, he could not shake it loose. He began to think about escape. Escape was something that enslaved people thought about constantly and attempted rarely. The odds against success were overwhelming. The plantation was surrounded by hostile territory, with patrollers constantly on the lookout for runaways. Dogs were trained specifically to track human scent. Rivers and swamps presented natural barriers that killed as many fugitives as the bullets of slave catchers. Even if someone managed to travel the hundreds of miles to northern states, the Fugitive Slave Act meant they could be captured and returned at any time. Real freedom meant reaching Canada, which might as well have been on the moon for most enslaved people in the Deep South. And yet, people tried. Every year, a few brave or desperate souls would take their chances in the darkness, would risk everything for even the possibility of freedom. Most were caught within days. Some were never heard from again, presumed dead in the swamps or the river. A very few managed to disappear, their fate unknown, but their absence a constant reminder that escape was at least theoretically possible. Abe had never seriously considered attempting it himself. He had no family left, no particular destination in mind, and he understood the mathematics of survival too well to throw his life away on a gesture. But now there was the gorilla. Abe knew that the animal's life on this plantation would be short and brutal. He also knew that in some fundamental way, he and this creature were bound together, linked by shared trauma and a history that predated their current imprisonment. If he was going to attempt something as insane as escape, this was the moment before he had time to think better of it, before his courage failed. The plan that formed in Abe's mind over the following weeks was less a coherent strategy than a series of desperate gambles strung together. The first and most crucial element was freeing the gorilla from his cage. Abe had observed the lock mechanism carefully during his visits to the barn. It was sturdy but not complex, designed more to contain an animal than to resist deliberate tampering. The key hung on a hook near Brennan's office, and Abe knew there were brief windows of time when the office was empty. The risk was enormous, but Abe had reached a point where risk felt less terrifying than the alternative of slow death by degrees. He also knew that simply freeing the gorilla was not enough. The animal might run, but he would be shot or captured within hours. No, if this was going to work at all, they would need to travel together, would need to use the gorilla's strength and a baby's knowledge to navigate the hostile landscape between the plantation and any hope of real freedom. A baby's ultimate goal was audacious to the point of madness. He wanted to return to Africa, not just to flee north, but to actually cross the ocean again, to bring himself and the gorilla back to the land they had both been stolen from. He knew it was insane. He had no money, no connections, no realistic way to book passage on a ship, even if he somehow made it to a port city. But the idea had taken hold with such force that rationality seemed beside the point. This was not about logic or probability. This was about refusing to accept that the violence that had been done to him and to the gorilla was final, was permanent, was something that could never be challenged or undone. Even if the attempt killed him, even if it was doomed from the start, a baby felt compelled to try. He began making careful preparations. He hoarded small amounts of food from his rations, hiding dried corn and strips of salted meat in a sack he kept buried near the quarters. He stole a knife from the plantation's smithy, a simple but sharp blade that could serve as both tool and weapon. He listened carefully to conversations among the enslaved workers, particularly those who had worked in the fields near the property boundaries, gathering information about patrol routes and the locations of the most dangerous obstacles. He also began visiting the gorilla nightly, gradually building trust, getting the animal accustomed to his presence and his voice. The gorilla, for his part, seemed to understand on some instinctual level that a baby was different from the other humans on the plantation. He no longer displayed aggression when a baby approached. He would sit calmly watching a baby with those intelligent eyes, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. Bibi began leaving small gifts, handfuls of wild berries he foraged at the edges of the fields, or pieces of sugar cane he managed to pile her. The gorilla would accept these offerings gently, with a delicacy that seemed at odds with his massive size and obvious power. Abe chose a night in early December for the escape. The weather was growing colder, which meant fewer people would be out after dark, fewer chance encounters that could expose them. The moon was in its dark phase, which would make travel harder, but also make them less visible to pursuers. Most importantly, Whitmore was hosting a gathering of neighboring planters that night, which meant extra distractions, extra drinking, and guards whose attention would be focused on the main house rather than the barn or the quarters. As night fell and the sounds of the party drifted across the plantation grounds, Abe made his final preparations. He told no one what he was planning, not because he distrusted his fellow enslaved workers, but because he did not want to put them at risk. If anyone else knew about the escape and failed to report it, they would be punished as severely as if they had participated. This had to be Abe's burden alone. He retrieved his hidden supplies, strapped the knife to his waist, and waited for the right moment. Around midnight, when the party was at its peak and even the guards had been drinking, Abe slipped out of the quarters. His heart pounded so hard he was certain it could be heard, but the night remained quiet except for distant laughter from the main house. He moved like a shadow toward Brennan's office, using the techniques his father had taught him decades ago, placing each foot carefully, controlling his breathing, becoming part of the darkness. The office was unlocked, which was both a relief and a terror. If Brennan had locked it, Abe might have taken it as a sign to abandon the whole plan. But the open door seemed to pull him forward. The key hung where it always did. Abe's hand trembled as he reached for it, expecting at any moment to hear a shout, to feel a hand grab his shoulder, to have the whole desperate plan collapse before it even began. But the moment passed. He palmed the key, left the office, and moved toward the barn. Every step felt like walking through deep water, time stretching and contracting strangely. He was certain he would be caught. And yet somehow he continued forward, reaching the barn door, slipping inside, closing it behind him. The gorilla was awake, standing at the front of his cage as if he had been expecting a baby. In the darkness, his eyes reflected what little light penetrated the barn, giving him an almost supernatural appearance. Abe approached the cage, speaking softly in the language of his childhood. Telling the gorilla what he was about to do, asking for trust and cooperation, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet barn. The door swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. The gorilla stared at the open cage door as if unable to comprehend that the barrier was no longer there. Then slowly he stepped forward. He was enormous, even larger than a baby had fully appreciated while the creature was confined. Standing at full height, the gorilla was easily 7 feet tall with shoulders that seemed wider than a doorframe. He moved past a baby and into the open space of the barn, turning in a slow circle, processing his new freedom. A baby held his breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine everything. If the gorilla ran, if he panicked, if he made noise that attracted attention, the escape would be over before it started. But the gorilla did not run. Instead, he turned back to Abe and made a soft huffing sound, almost like a question. Abe gestured toward the barn door, then toward the darkness beyond. The gorilla tilted his head, considering, then nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that sent a shiver down Abe's spine. Whatever connection they had formed, it was strong enough to hold even now. They left the barn together, moving into the night. Abe led the way, heading not toward the main road but toward the back fields and the woods beyond. He knew that their absence would be discovered eventually, probably by morning, and that pursuit would be immediate and ruthless. But he also knew the land, knew the places where the swamp grew too thick for dogs to follow easily, knew the old hunting paths that might hide their passage. The gorilla moved with surprising quiet for such a massive creature, following a baby's lead, stopping when Abe stopped, waiting when Abe paused to listen for sounds of danger. They reached the tree line as the first light of false dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Behind them, from the direction of the plantation, came the sound that a baby had been dreading. The ringing of the alarm bell, loud and insistent, shattering the quiet of early morning. Their absence had been discovered. The hunt would begin in minutes. Abe looked at the gorilla, saw his own fear reflected in those dark eyes, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Two stolen souls attempting the impossible, reaching for a freedom that the world insisted they could never have. They plunged into the woods as behind them the plantation erupted into chaos, and the long, desperate journey toward home began. The forest that stretched beyond the boundaries of Sweetwater Grove was nothing like the jungle where a baby had spent his childhood. These were the bottomlands of the Mississippi Delta, where cypress and tupelo trees rose from standing water, their roots creating twisted mazes that could trap the unwary. Spanish moss hung from every branch like gray beards, and the air was thick with moisture and the smell of decay. In summer, these swamps were unbearably hot and infested with mosquitoes, but in December, they were merely cold and miserable, the water low enough to wade through, but still deep enough to slow travel and leave clear tracks in the mud. A baby had spent years working these fields, had occasionally been sent to hunt or gather wood from the forest edges, and had absorbed more knowledge of the local terrain than his overseers realized. He knew that there were islands of higher ground scattered through the swamp, places where the water did not reach and where they might rest without leaving obvious signs of their passage. He also knew that the deeper they went into the swamp, the less likely the slave catchers would follow quickly. These men were brave enough when they had dogs and guns and numbers on their side, but even they thought twice about spending days in cold water with snakes and alligators. The gorilla followed a baby without hesitation, his massive frame moving through the water with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Occasionally, he would pause to examine something, a particular tree or plant, as if checking to see whether anything in this strange landscape matched his own distant memories of forests. Abe could only imagine what must be going through the animal's mind, whether he understood where they were going or if he was simply following out of trust. Either way, his presence was both a comfort and a complication. On one hand, the gorilla's strength could prove invaluable if they encountered dangers. On the other hand, he was impossible to hide, a creature so distinctive that anyone who saw them would remember and report their direction. They traveled through that first day without stopping, driven by the knowledge that Brennan and his men would be organizing a pursuit. Abby could picture the scene clearly, having witnessed other escape attempts over the years. The dogs would be brought out, bloodhounds trained to track human scent across impossible distances. Patrollers would be summoned from neighboring plantations, armed men on horses who earned bounties for every escaped slave they returned. Whitmore himself might join the hunt, furious at the loss of his exotic prize and determined to make an example of the man who had dared to steal it. As afternoon light began to filter through the canopy, Abe finally allowed them to stop on a small island of relatively dry ground. The gorilla collapsed immediately, clearly exhausted despite his strength. Abe realized that the animal had likely never had to travel such distances before, that his life in captivity had robbed him of the endurance his wild existence would have required. Abe broke out some of the food he had hoarded, offering dried corn and strips of meat to the gorilla, who accepted them gratefully. They ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the swamp around them, the calls of birds, and the distant splash of something large entering the water. Abe knew they could not stay in the swamp forever. His ultimate goal was to reach the Mississippi River and follow it south to New Orleans. It was a journey of more than 100 miles through hostile territory, but New Orleans offered possibilities that nowhere else did. It was a port city, diverse and chaotic, where a black man might potentially move with slightly more freedom than in the rural plantation districts. More importantly, it was where ships came and went, including ships that crossed the Atlantic. Abe had no clear plan for how he would get himself and a gorilla aboard such a vessel, but he knew that any chance of returning to Africa had to start there. The immediate problem was covering ground without being caught. Abe estimated they had traveled perhaps 10 miles from the plantation, which meant that they were still well within the radius that Brennan's hunting parties would search. They needed to move faster, but the swamp was deliberately slowing their progress. Abe made a decision that he knew was risky but necessary. They would leave the swamp and travel overland, moving at night and hiding during the day. It would be more dangerous in terms of exposure, but it would allow them to cover more distance. That night, they emerged from the swamp and began following a rough path that paralleled a rarely used road. The gorilla seemed to understand the need for silence and caution, moving with careful deliberation, pausing whenever Abe signaled danger. The December night was cold, and both of them were soaked from wading through the swamp. But they could not risk a fire. Instead, they pressed forward, mile after difficult mile, guided by the stars that Abby had learned to read during the Middle Passage, the same stars that had guided slaves and fugitives since time immemorial. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. They would travel from dusk until just before dawn, then find a hidden place to rest, usually deep in the woods, away from roads or paths. Abbe would scout ahead while the guerrilla rested, looking for signs of pursuit or potential dangers. They saw other people occasionally, enslaved workers in the fields or travelers on the road, but they always managed to hide or change direction before being spotted. The guerrilla proved remarkably adaptable, seeming to understand that their survival depended on remaining unseen. Food became a growing concern. A baby's supplies ran out after the third day, and foraging in December was difficult. They found wild pimmons and nuts, dug up roots that Abby remembered being edible, and once managed to catch fish from a stream, the guerrilla's quick reflexes proving useful for snatching them from the water. It was not enough to fully satisfy their hunger, but it kept them moving. The guerrilla lost weight rapidly, his powerful body burning through reserves as they traveled. Abe worried that the animal might become too weak to continue, but the guerrilla never complained, never refused to move forward. His determination matched Abby's own. On the seventh night, they had their first serious encounter with danger. They were moving along a back road when they heard horses approaching. There was no time to hide properly, no convenient forest nearby to disappear into. A baby quickly led the guerrilla into a drainage ditch beside the road, and they pressed themselves as flat as they could against the muddy bottom, hoping that the darkness would hide them. The riders passed within yards of their position, patrollers by the sound of their conversation, discussing the escaped slave and the missing guerrilla that the whole county was now talking about. Abe held his breath, willing his heart to beat quieter, feeling the guerrilla's massive body tense beside him. But the riders continued on without pausing, and after several agonizing minutes, the sound of hooves faded into the distance. They lay in that ditch for another hour, making sure the coast was clear before finally emerging, covered in mud and shaking from cold and fear. The guerrilla made a soft sound that Abe interpreted as distress, and he reached out to touch the animal's arm, trying to offer comfort. They were both exhausted, both pushed beyond their limits, but they had no choice except to keep moving. Around the 10th day, Abe began to recognize landmarks that suggested they were getting close to the Mississippi River. The land was flatter here, the soil darker and richer. They passed through the edges of large plantations, staying well clear of the main buildings, but occasionally stealing food from storage sheds or smokehouses. It was dangerous, but necessary. On one such raid, the guerrilla demonstrated his intelligence by figuring out how to open a latch door that a baby had been struggling with, his powerful fingers manipulating the mechanism with surprising delicacy. When they finally reached the river, a baby felt a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, they'd covered an incredible distance and survived when the odds had been overwhelmingly against them. On the other hand, the Mississippi was a formidable barrier, wide and powerful, even in the winter low water season. They would need to find a way across, and then they would need to continue south along the far bank toward New Orleans, all while avoiding the increased population and attention that came with being closer to major settlements. A baby scouted along the riverbank until he found what he was looking for. A small landing with several boats tied up, probably belonging to fishermen or traders. He waited until deep night, then approached cautiously. The guerrilla waited in the shadows nearby, understanding without being told that his presence near human habitations would cause immediate alarm. Abby chose the most weathered and least valuable-looking boat, hoping it might not be missed immediately, and began working to free it from its mooring. His hands were clumsy with cold and fatigue, and the knot seemed determined not to come loose. But finally, he managed to free the boat and drag it to the water's edge. Getting the guerrilla into the boat was a challenge a baby had not fully anticipated. The animal was heavy, easily 400 pounds of muscle and bone, and the small boat rocked dangerously as he climbed aboard. For a terrifying moment, Abe thought they would capsize before they even pushed off from shore. But the guerrilla seemed to understand the problem and distributed his weight carefully, settling into the bottom of the boat with impressive stability. Abe pushed off and began rowing, fighting against the current, aiming for a point downstream on the opposite bank. The crossing took hours, Abe's muscles screaming with effort as he fought to keep them moving in the right direction. The current was stronger than he had expected, and several times he thought they would be swept downriver into areas where they would surely be spotted. But gradually, painfully, they made progress. The gorilla sat perfectly still throughout the ordeal, his eyes fixed on Abe, his expression unreadable, but somehow communicating trust. When they finally reached the western bank and dragged the boat ashore, Abe collapsed for several minutes, his arms useless, his lungs burning. The gorilla waited patiently, then gently touched Abe's shoulder as if to remind him that they could not rest for long. They abandoned the boat and pushed into the forest on the western side of the river. Abe knew that they were now in Louisiana proper, that New Orleans lay somewhere to the south, perhaps 50 miles away, perhaps more. He had no map, no clear sense of the route, only a general direction and a stubborn refusal to give up. They continued their pattern of night travel and day rest, working their way through a landscape of plantations and small settlements, always moving, always hiding, always one step ahead of discovery. The journey took another 2 weeks. Along the way, they encountered dangers and small miracles in equal measure. They narrowly avoided a group of slave catchers who had set up camp along one of the roads they needed to cross. They were forced to wade through another swamp when their planned route proved too exposed. The gorilla developed a fever, forcing them to stop for 2 full days, while a baby tended to him with what limited medicinal knowledge he possessed, using bark and roots to make a tea that seemed to help. There were moments when a baby was certain they would be caught. Moments when he was sure the gorilla would die. Moments when his own strength failed and he wanted nothing more than to lie down and stop fighting. But somehow, they kept going. And then, on a cold January morning, they saw it. From a hill overlooking the lands, they caught their first glimpse of New Orleans in the distance. A sprawl of buildings and church spires rising from the flat landscape, smoke from thousands of chimneys creating a haze above the city. Ships crowded the waterfront, their masts like a forest of dead trees. It was the largest settlement Abe had seen since Charleston, and it represented both hope and danger in equal measure. They had reached the first major milestone of their impossible journey. Now came the even more difficult task of finding a way across the ocean. Abe and the gorilla did not enter New Orleans directly. Instead, they made camp in the woods several miles outside the city. Close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid casual discovery. Abe needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to accomplish what still seemed like an impossible goal. He knew that the city would be full of slave catchers, patrollers, and bounty hunters. He also knew that as a black man without papers, he would be assumed to be a slave and subject to immediate arrest if he could not prove his free status. And the gorilla was even more problematic. There was no way to bring such a creature into the city without attracting immediate and overwhelming attention. For several days, Abe scouted the approaches to New Orleans, observing the patterns of life on the outskirts. He watched enslaved workers coming and going from nearby plantations, traders moving goods along the roads, sailors on shore leaves staggering back toward the docks. He began to form the outline of a plan, desperate and risky like everything else they had done, but at least possible in theory. New Orleans in 1880 was a complex place, racially and culturally. Unlike the rural plantation districts they had traveled through, the city had a substantial population of free black people, many of whom were descendants of French and Spanish colonial unions, people who occupied an ambiguous middle ground in the strict racial hierarchies of the South. While they certainly did not have anything approaching equality with whites, they had some degree of legal protection and economic opportunity. Abe reasoned that if he could somehow pass as a free black person, if he could blend into that community, even temporarily, he might be able to move with slightly more freedom than he had in the countryside. The gorilla, however, presented an insurmountable problem for any conventional approach. There was no way to disguise or hide a 400-pound silverback gorilla in an urban environment. What Abe needed was not to hide the gorilla, but to find someone who could take him legally, someone who had the resources and motivation to transport an exotic animal across the Atlantic. It was a wild notion, but Abe had heard stories over the years about animal dealers, about men who made their living capturing and trading exotic creatures for zoos and exhibitions. If he could find such a person, if he could somehow convince them to take the gorilla and himself as a package, there might be a chance. This plan required a baby to do something he had not done in over 20 years, to walk openly among people as if he had a right to be there. It required paperwork he did not have, confidence he had spent decades learning to suppress, and luck that had not exactly been abundant in their journey so far. But he could see no alternative. They had come hundreds of miles, had survived impossible odds, and they were so close to the ocean that a baby could almost smell the salt in the air when the wind came from the south. He would not turn back now. A baby spent an afternoon stealing clothes from a washing line on the outskirts of the city, replacing his tattered plantation rags with garments that, while worn, at least looked like they belonged to a free person rather than a slave. He used water from a stream to wash as much of the accumulated dirt and sweat from his skin as possible. He practiced speaking in the way he had heard free black men speak in the city markets he had visited decades ago when his master's father had brought him along on trading trips, trying to recall the subtle differences in tone and posture that marked the distinction between enslaved and free in a world obsessed with such markers. Then, on a morning in late January, he left the gorilla hidden in their camp with strict instructions to stay quiet and hidden, and he walked into New Orleans alone for the first time. His heart hammered with every step. He expected to be stopped, questioned, arrested at any moment. But as he merged with the flow of people on the outskirts of the city, as he kept his eyes down but his posture confident, something remarkable happened. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned his presence. In the chaos and diversity of New Orleans, one more black man moving through the streets was not worth a second glance. Abe made his way toward the docks, drawn by the forest of masts and the smell of tar and salt water. The waterfront was a riot of activity, with ships being loaded and unloaded, merchants haggling, sailors working, and the whole polyglot culture of a major port on display. Abe listened to conversations trying to identify anyone who might deal in exotic animals. He lurked near taverns where sailors gathered, hearing tales of voyages to Africa, Asia, and South America. And slowly, through careful observation and a few cautiously asked questions, he began to hear about a particular ship and a particular man. The ship was called the Mariposa, and she was a merchant vessel that ran regular routes between New Orleans, Cuba, and the African coast, trading in goods that a baby suspected included some that were not entirely legal. The man was her captain, a Dutchman named Van Horn, who had a reputation for being willing to transport unusual cargo for the right price. People spoke of him with a mixture of respect and weariness, suggesting that he was competent but not necessarily scrupulous. To a baby, this sounded like exactly the kind of person who might be convinced to help, assuming a baby had anything to offer in exchange. The problem, of course, was that her baby had nothing. No money, no valuable goods, nothing but his own labor and a stolen gorilla. But as he walked the docks, observing the Mariposa where she lay at anchor, an idea began to form. Van Horn dealt in exotic goods. A live gorilla properly presented might be exactly the kind of unique commodity that would interest him, especially if a baby could convince him that the gorilla was already tame, already manageable, already a valuable asset rather than a dangerous liability. It took a baby 3 more trips into the city before he worked up the courage to approach the Mariposa's crew. He timed his arrival for early evening, when men had been drinking but were not yet fully drunk, when guards might be slightly less vigilant. He found a sailor from the Mariposa in a dark side tavern, and with a boldness born of desperation, struck up a conversation. He claimed to be a free black man who worked as an animal handler, who had in his possession a remarkable gorilla that he was looking to sell or trade for passage. The sailor was skeptical, but intrigued enough to mention the conversation to others. Word filtered up the chain, and within 2 days Abe received a message to meet with someone from the ship. The meeting took place on the Mariposa itself. Abe was led aboard by a suspicious first mate who frisked him for weapons and made clear that any trouble would result in his immediate and violent ejection. Captain Van Horn was a weathered man in his 50s, with the deeply tanned skin of someone who had spent his life under the sun and the calculating eyes of a successful merchant. He listened to Abe's story with obvious skepticism, asking pointed questions about how a black man came to possess a gorilla, why he was so eager to reach Africa, and what made him think Van Horn would be interested in any of this. Abe had prepared for these questions. He claimed that he had inherited the gorilla from an employer who had died, that he was from a family that had been free for generations, and that he wished to visit relatives in Liberia, the American colony in West Africa. These lies came easily now, born of necessity and practice during his solo trips into the city. He described the gorilla in glowing terms, emphasizing its size and health, claiming it was tame and could be handled safely. He offered the animal to Van Horn in exchange for passage, arguing that a live gorilla would fetch an enormous price in European markets, far more than the cost of 2 more mouths on a ship heading to Africa. Anyway, Van Horn was not a stupid man, and the baby could tell he suspected at least some parts of the story were fabrications, but he was also a practical businessman who recognized an opportunity. Exotic animals were indeed valuable, and a live gorilla, if it was as impressive as a baby claimed, could potentially be sold for a substantial sum. After a long silence, during which a baby was certain he would be rejected or arrested, Van Horn made a counteroffer. He would examine the gorilla. If the animal was as described and could be safely transported, he would provide passage for both Abe and the gorilla to the African coast. In exchange, he would own the gorilla upon arrival and would sell it for his own profit. Abe would be free to disembark in Africa and make his own way from there. It was not ideal. Abe had hoped to bring the gorilla home to the forests to release him to the life he had been stolen from, but he was pragmatic enough to recognize that this offer was better than any alternative he was likely to find. He agreed to Van Horn's terms, and they set a date 3 days hence for the captain to examine the merchandise. Getting the gorilla from their hidden camp to the arranged meeting point outside the city was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of Abe's life. They had to travel in full daylight along roads where they might be seen to a location that Abe had never visited before. The gorilla seemed to sense the importance of the moment and moved with careful silence. But his size made concealment impossible. Every moment Abe expected to hear shouts, to see armed men appear to have their desperate gambit collapse. But somehow they made it to the meeting point, an abandoned warehouse near the water where Van Horn had arranged to inspect the gorilla away from curious eyes. When the captain arrived with 2 of his crew, Abe saw the mixture of astonishment and calculation on their faces as they took in the massive silverback. The gorilla, for his part, regarded these new humans with wary suspicion but did not display aggression, especially with Abe standing beside him. Van Horn circled the animal slowly, keeping a respectful distance, examining him with the eye of someone evaluating valuable merchandise. After several minutes of tense silence, Van Horn nodded slowly. He asked Abe several questions about the gorilla's temperament, his feeding habits, whether he had ever attacked anyone. Abe lied smoothly, claiming the animal was docile and accustomed to human handling, leaving out the parts about cages and rage and the desperate escape that had brought them here. Van Horn seemed satisfied, or at least satisfied enough. He confirmed that the Mariposa would sail in 1 week, that Abe and the gorilla should be at the docks on the specified day, and that once they were aboard, the deal would be binding. That week was simultaneously the longest and shortest of Abe's life. They remained hidden in their camp, venturing out only briefly for food and water. Abe worried constantly that something would go wrong, that slave catchers would discover them at the last moment, that Van Horn would change his mind, that the ship would sail without them. The gorilla seemed to pick up on his anxiety, becoming more restless and harder to keep calm. But Abe talked to him constantly in the language of their shared homeland, telling him that they were going home, that the nightmare was almost over. On the appointed day, they made their way to the docks in the pre-dawn darkness. Abe wore his stolen freeman clothes, and the gorilla walked beside him like a strange shadow in the dim light. They attracted stares from the few people who were out at that hour, but they moved quickly and reached the Mariposa without incident. Van Horn was waiting, and he wasted no time. The gorilla was led below deck into a specially prepared hold, one that was larger and better ventilated than the cages he had endured before, but still unmistakably a prison. Abe wanted to protest, wanted to insist that the animal be treated better, but he swallowed his objections. They were so close now. Any complications could ruin everything. Abe himself was assigned a space near the gorilla, ostensibly so he could care for the animal during the voyage. It was not comfortable, and it was clear that the crew regarded him with suspicion and hostility, but it was passage. As dawn broke and the Mariposa raised her sails as the city of New Orleans began to shrink behind them and the open water of the Gulf of Mexico stretched ahead, Abe felt something he had not felt in over 20 years. Not quite hope, not quite peace, but something in that direction. They had done it. Against every odd, against all reason, they had actually done it. They were going home. The voyage across the Atlantic took nearly 2 months. 2 months of cramped conditions, poor food, and the constant roll of the ship. For Abe, it was a strange echo of his first crossing, the one that had brought him to America as a terrified child. But this time, he was traveling in the opposite direction. And this time, he was not alone. The gorilla adapted to life aboard ship with surprising resilience. Abe cared for him carefully, ensuring he had adequate food and water, talking to him constantly, maintaining the bond that had sustained them through their impossible escape. The crew of the Mariposa were a rough lot, men from a dozen different countries, who asked few questions and expected none answered. They regarded the gorilla with a mixture of fear and fascination, giving the animal a wide berth, but occasionally stopping to stare through the bars of his hold. Van Horn checked on his investment regularly, clearly satisfied with his decision to take the risk. He spoke to Abe occasionally, asking questions about Africa, about Abe's supposed relatives in Liberia, questions that Abe answered with carefully maintained lies. As the voyage progressed and the ship entered African waters, a baby felt emotions rising that he had suppressed for decades. This was the ocean his ancestors had known, the water that surrounded the land of his birth. He spent hours on deck when he was allowed, staring at the horizon, waiting for the first glimpse of the coast. When it finally appeared, a dark line separating water from sky, Abe felt tears streaming down his face. The gorilla, somehow sensing the moment, made a sound that Abe had never heard from him before. A long, complex vocalization that sounded almost like singing. The Mariposa made port at a trading station near the mouth of a river that Abe did not recognize, but that felt somehow familiar. Anyway, Van Horn was efficient about his business. He had already arranged a buyer for the gorilla, a European collector who planned to ship the animal to a zoo in Belgium. A baby's heart broke at this news, but he had known from the beginning that this was the deal. He had secured their passage, but he had not secured their freedom. Not really. On the night before the gorilla was to be transferred to his new owner, a baby visited him one last time in the hold. The ship was quiet, most of the crew ashore, drinking in the local establishments. Abby sat near the bars of the gorilla's enclosure and spoke to him for hours in the language of their homeland, saying goodbye, saying thank you, asking for forgiveness. The gorilla listened, his eyes fixed on Abby's face, and Abby was certain the animal understood. If not the words, then at least the emotions behind them. And then, in a moment of decision that surprised even himself, Abe made one final choice. He had the keys to the enclosure had been trusted with them to care for the animal. He used them now to open the door to give the gorilla one last chance at freedom. He led the massive creature up onto the deck and then over the side of the ship into the shallow water near shore. The gorilla stood in the water, looking back at Abe, his expression questioning. A baby pointed toward the forest that was visible in the darkness, the trees that called to something deep in both their souls. He urged the gorilla to run, to disappear, to take the freedom that Abe was offering, even if it meant breaking his deal with Van Horn. For a long moment the gorilla did not move. Then slowly he waded to shore. He paused at the edge of the forest, turned back one last time to look at Abby, and raised his left hand in what might have been a wave or a gesture of farewell. Abe saw the crescent mark on his palm, pale against the dark skin, the same mark he had first noticed a quarter-century ago, when they were both young, and the world had not yet stolen them. Then the gorilla turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed and silence that suggested he remembered how to be wild, remembered what it meant to be free. Abe stood on the deck of the Mariposa and watched the forest until dawn, knowing that Van Horn would be furious when he discovered the loss, knowing that he might face consequences for this betrayal. But he did not care. He had made a promise to himself during their escape, a promise that he would do everything in his power to restore what had been stolen. Even if it cost him, the gorilla was home now, truly home. In a way that a baby himself might never manage. It was enough. When Van Horn discovered the escape, His rage was as volcanic as a baby had expected. He threatened a baby with prison, with being sold back into slavery with physical violence. But in the end, the practical captain recognized that pursuing the matter would be more trouble than it was worth. He threw a baby off his ship with nothing but the clothes he wore, washing his hands of the entire affair. Abbey found himself standing on African soil for the first time in over 20 years, penniless and alone, but free in a way he had not been since childhood. He spent the following weeks working his way along the coast, hiring himself out for labor, slowly making his way back toward the region where he thought his village might have been. He knew the chances of finding it were slim, knew that even if he did, everyone he had known would likely be gone, dead, or scattered. But he had to try. He had come too far, had sacrificed too much not to make the attempt. What he found was both heartbreaking and hopeful. His village was gone, destroyed and abandoned decades ago. But there were other villages, other people who spoke languages he partially understood, who welcomed him as a returning son of Africa. He settled in one of these communities, working as a hunter and guide, using the skills his father had taught him, and that somehow, despite everything, he had not entirely forgotten. He never married, never had children, but he found a kind of peace in his final years. And sometimes in the early morning or late evening, he would walk to the edge of the forest and look into the shadows beneath the trees. He never saw the gorilla again, never found any trace of him. But occasionally he would hear something, a distant roar or call that sounded familiar, that sounded like home. And a baby would smile knowing that somewhere in those forests, a gorilla with a crescent mark on his left palm lived free, a survivor who had returned from the impossible, a testament to the unbreakable will to be free. That lived in the hearts of all stolen souls who refused to accept that their bondage was permanent. It was the ending of a journey that should never have happened, a reunion that defied every law of probability and fate. Two beings torn from the same forests, stolen by the same evil, had found each other in the worst place imaginable, and had together traveled the impossible distance home. Their story would never be recorded in any history book, would never be acknowledged by the men who had enslaved them both. But it happened nonetheless, a small victory in a world of overwhelming injustice, a reminder that even in the darkest times the human spirit, and perhaps the spirit of all living things, could refuse to be broken, could find ways to resist, to survive, and ultimately against all odds to return.